Montana Territory, 1877. The day Flora Sutton got bartered for horses, the sky was clear and blue like it did not care what was happening below it. She stood rigid in the dirt yard of her father's homestead, hands clenched at her sides, her mouth pressed into a hard line. The two bay geldings stood hitched behind her, restless and nervous. Her father, Abel Sutton, wiped sweat from his brow and turned to the man in the wide-brimmed hat. Two strong ones, sound in the legs, full-grown and trained for the plow, Abel said, jerking his thumb toward the horses. And all I ask in return is her. He said it like he was offering up a sack of grain. Flora's voice did not shake. I am not going with him. Abel did not look at her. You will. The man across from them, a leather-faced rancher named Clive Morrow, had the kind of smile that made Flora's skin crawl. He nodded once. She'll do. I said I am not, that is enough, girl, Abel snapped. You think you got better prospects out here? You are 22 and still unmarried. You eat my bread, sleep under my roof. I am done feeding a mouth that gives nothing back. Flora stared at her father. Her mother had died 6 winters ago, and from that moment on, everything warm in their home had gone with her. Abel had turned to whiskey and bitterness, and Flora had turned to herself, keeping quiet, keeping useful. She had not expected love from him, but this was a final kind of cruelty. Clive stepped forward, reaching for her arm. That was when the voice came. She is not going anywhere with you. The voice was low and even, hard as iron. Every head turned. The man who had spoken leaned against the fence, arms crossed, a cold peacemaker resting easy on his hip. He had been there the whole time, quiet, watching. Flora had noticed him when he first rode in with the stage 2 days ago. He had stayed at the boarding house, kept to himself mostly. Some said he was a gunslinger. Others said he was just passing through. But now he stepped forward, all steady movements and sharp eyes beneath a black hat. Abel scowled. This is none of your concern, stranger. The man looked right at Flora. My name is Merritt Hale, and I will marry her. Right now. Today. You will not trade her like cattle. Flora blinked. What? Merritt did not take his eyes off her. If you will have me. Clive barked a laugh. You think you can just ride in? And Merritt turned his head. You want to draw on me, Morrow, go ahead. But you better be fast. Clive hesitated. Then he spat in the dirt and walked away, muttering. Abel looked between Merritt and Flora, jaw tight. You are no better than he is. What do you want with her? Merritt shrugged. Nothing, except to stop you from throwing her away. She deserves better than this. Abel sneered. She is your problem now. You marry her. She is gone from my land. He turned and walked away. Just like that. Flora stood frozen. Merritt looked at her, his voice low. You do not have to say yes. I will still get you out of here. I just thought this way. No one can take you again. Flora stared at him. Her throat was tight. You do not even know me. I know enough, Merritt said. And I mean what I said. You deserve better. She did not know why, but her eyes burned. They were married at sundown. The preacher from town had been hesitant, but Merritt held his gaze and said, It is real. And Flora stood beside him, not shaking like she thought she would, but steady. Not because she trusted him yet, but because he had given her a choice when no one else had. They rode out that night. Merritt had a black gelding and a pack horse. He helped her up without a word and kept easy pace beside her. They made camp in a small stand of cottonwoods near the creek. Merritt laid out a bedroll for her, then took the other side of the fire. You do not have to stay, Flora said, watching him through the firelight. You did what you did. You could go. I do not want to go, Merritt said simply. She looked down at her fingers. Why? He paused. Because I do not like the way that felt. Watching someone try to take you like he had every right. Flora swallowed. You do not know what you are getting. I am not. I am not soft. I do not know how to be anyone's wife. I am not asking you to be anything but safe, he said. Silence stretched between them, long and quiet. The fire popped once. You are not what I expected, she said. I get that a lot. She looked at him again. His face was rough with stubble, but his eyes were calm, steady. She had not seen eyes like that before, not in a man like him. When she fell asleep, it was the first time in weeks she did not dream of being trapped. The next few days were quiet. They rode west, away from her father's land, through wide open country where the sun painted the hills gold and the wind smelled like pine. Merritt did not push her to talk. He gave her space. But he was there every time her horse stumbled, every time she hesitated. He never touched her without asking. He never looked at her like she owed him something. On the 5th day, they reached a small town near the Bitterroot Mountains. Merritt traded for supplies and found them a room above the livery. It was small but clean. Flora stood by the window, watching the street below. Merritt leaned against the doorframe. "I will sleep downstairs if you want the bed," he said. She turned to him. "You do not have to." He looked at her. "I know." She stepped closer. "I do not know what this is yet, but I feel safe with you." His voice was quiet. "That is all I want." She nodded. Then, after a long pause, she reached out and touched his hand. He closed his fingers around hers gently, like he was afraid she might change her mind. She did not. That night, they shared the same bed. Not in the way her father would have assumed. They just lay there, side by side, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her. And when she woke in the dark, her heart no longer thudded with fear. Instead, there was a stillness inside her. A quiet peace. She turned her face toward him and whispered, "Thank you." Merritt's voice was husky with sleep. "You never have to thank me for being on your side." And she knew in that moment she was not alone anymore. The room above the livery had thin walls and a slanted ceiling, but the rain that rolled in midweek sounded soft against the roof, like a lullaby too tired to carry a tune. Flora sat at the wooden table by the window, mending a torn sleeve Merritt had left folded on the chair. The needle tugged through the fabric with a rhythm that steadied her breathing. Merritt came in just before dusk, shoulders damp from the drizzle, the scent of wet dust clinging to his coat. He set down a sack of flour and a pouch of beans on the table, then pulled off his hat, flicking away a drop of water. "I traded for a skillet," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "Figured you might get tired of boiled everything." Flora tied off the thread and laid the shirt across the back of the chair. "You didn't have to do that." He shrugged and sat down across from her. "I wanted to." She watched him for a moment. "You take on too much." "I don't mind it. You don't know how long you're going to be stuck with me." He leaned back slightly. "What makes you think I'm stuck?" Flora opened her mouth, then closed it again. She stood and went to the stove, where a kettle hissed faintly. "I'll make tea." She poured the hot water into 2 tin cups. Merritt took his without a word, cradling it between his fingers. There was no fire in the stove yet, just the warmth of the kettle and the faint scent of pine smoke from below. The room didn't need more heat, just time. He took a slow sip, then looked at her over the rim. "I asked around in town. There's a widow runs a boarding house north of here, closer to Flathead Lake. Folks say she's kind, hires help when she can." Flora's brows pulled together. "You think I should go work for her?" "No," he said, setting his cup down. "I think if you wanted to, it'd be a place to start fresh. But I'm not asking you to leave. I just figured you might want choices." She stared down at the steam curling from her cup. "No one's ever asked me what I want." "Well," he said, his voice low, "I'm asking." She moved to the window, pressing her hand to the glass. The street below was quiet, the rain making puddles in the wheel ruts. "I don't know yet." "What I want, I mean." "That's allowed." She turned. "And you? What do you want?" There was a long pause. "I want to stay where I'm welcome," Merritt said. "And maybe if you'll let me build something. Doesn't have to be much. Just ours." Flora's chest tightened. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. Later, she braided her hair slowly, sitting on the edge of the bed. Merritt was on the floor beside the stove, cleaning his rifle with a cloth and a quiet care that made her throat ache. "Who taught you that?" she asked, nodding toward the rifle. "My uncle. After my father died, he took me in. Put a rifle in my hands before I could read proper." "Did you want that?" He didn't look up. Didn't know enough to want anything else. Flora stood and crossed the room. She knelt beside him, her skirt folding around her legs. "And now?" He paused, then set the cloth down. "Now I want to stop moving. To have walls that don't feel borrowed. To sleep without my boots beside the bed. She reached out and touched his hand. Then let's find land. His eyes met hers. You sure? No, she said, her voice soft. But I'd like to try. He nodded once, and that was enough. They left town 2 days later, the rain gone, the sky pale with spring. Merritt had traded for 2 canvas packs and a bundle of fence wire. Flora carried a folded map in her coat pocket, marked with a red X where the widow said the land hadn't yet been claimed. They rode without speaking much, but the silence between them had changed. It wasn't filled with fear anymore, it felt like soil turned over and waiting. That night they camped in a hollow between low hills. The stars came out quiet and slow. Merritt built a small fire, and Flora cooked beans with salt pork in the new skillet. They sat side by side on a folded blanket, knees almost touching. I used to think I'd die on my father's land, she said, stirring the pot. Not by violence. Just slowly, like a tree that doesn't get enough light. Merritt didn't speak right away. Then he said, not anymore. No, she said, and passed him the tin plate. Not anymore. He took it from her, fingers brushing hers. She didn't pull away. When the food was gone and the fire low, Merritt lay back and looked up at the stars. You ever think about how many lives you could have lived if things had gone different? I think about the one I want now, she said. He turned his head toward her, and she met his gaze. I want the one where no man decides for me again, she said. And I want the one where I wake up beside someone who listens. Merritt reached for her hand, slow and sure. Then let's build that one. She laced her fingers through his. And for the first time in her life, Flora Sutton felt like she had stepped into something that was hers. They found the land just past the edge of Swan Valley, where the river curved quiet and wide beneath a line of tamarack trees. The soil was dark and damp near the riverbank, and further up, where the pines thinned, the ground was flat enough to build. No one else had staked it. The widow had been right about that. Merritt hammered a post into the earth with the butt of his axe and tied a strip of red cloth to it, sealing the claim. Flora stood a few paces off, scanning the treeline. No neighbors. Merritt glanced up from the post. That bother you? No, she said. I like the quiet. Just seems unusual. He drove the second post in lower on the slope. Too many folks chasing gold or grazing rights. Flatland like this, tucked out of sight, it gets overlooked. They worked until their hands blistered. Merritt dug the first hole for the cabin's corner post while Flora paced out the length and width, her boots sinking slightly in the damp ground. They didn't speak unless there was a reason to, but there was no strain in the silence, just the rhythm of something beginning. By mid-afternoon, she paused to drink from the canvas pouch. Her braids stuck to the back of her neck, and her cheeks were flushed. Take a rest, Merritt said, wiping sweat from his temple. I'll start on the ridge beam. I can help with that. Just show me how. He studied her face, then handed her one end of the timber. Hold steady. If it slips, it'll break your foot, not mine. She nodded once. Fair enough. They hoisted the beam together, slow and careful. She grunted under the weight but didn't complain. When it was in place, she leaned against the post and blew out a breath. Merritt sat on the stump nearby, rubbing the back of his neck. You ever think about what you'd have done if I hadn't been there that day? No, she said. Doesn't feel useful. He nodded, not pressing. Instead, he pulled a folded sheet of paper from his coat pocket and handed it over. Flora took it, frowning slightly. What's this? Deed form. Found it at the land office back in Kalispell. Needs 2 names. She stared at it a moment. You want to put mine down. It's your land, too. She ran her thumb along the crease. You trust me that much? I married you. Didn't do it halfway. She didn't answer right away. Then she folded the paper again and tucked it into her satchel. I'll sign it when we finish the roof. That night they slept under canvas stretched between saplings. The air was cooler in the valley, the breeze carrying the scent of wet needles and moss. Merritt lay on his back, one arm folded behind his head. Flora sat cross-legged, scraping mud from her boots with a stick. Were you ever married before? She asked. No, he said. Came close once. She didn't press, but he went on without prompting. She was a schoolteacher in Dodge. Kind, bright. I thought I'd stay there, give up the trail. But her brother didn't want her marrying a man with guns on his belt. Said I'd bring trouble. Flora tossed the scraped mud into the fire. Did you? Not then. But I might have, eventually. I didn't know how to stay in one place back then. And now. He turned his head to look at her. Now I do. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. I never thought I'd have anything of my own. Not land, not a name worth saying. But this feels like something that could last. It will, he said. In the days that followed, they raised the walls. Merritt showed her how to notch the logs so they'd hold firm, and she worked the drawknife until her arms trembled. They shared the same tin pot of coffee each morning, the same callous silence in the evenings. When a bear passed near the river one afternoon, Merritt handed her the rifle first. You'll have to learn to shoot. She hesitated, then took it. Show me. He did. And when she fired, the sound cracked through the trees, scattering a pair of magpies. Her shoulder ached, but she didn't flinch. You're steadier than I was my first time, he said. I had a better teacher. When the roof beams were finally in place, Flora climbed the ladder Merritt had built from fence rails and looked out across the valley. The light angled low through the tamaracks and the river caught it like glass. Merritt leaned on the rung below her. Wind's shifting. We'll need to chink the walls before the snow comes. She looked down at him. Then we'd best keep moving. They didn't linger. They didn't need to. The work bound them faster than words ever could, and when Merritt brushed a strand of hair from her cheek that night, she leaned into his hand without hesitation. They had built the start of a home. And in the way Merritt looked at her quiet, certain Flora saw the shape of a life she had never dared to want. But now that it had begun, she would not let it go. The first hard frost came before the walls were packed with moss and clay, and it caught them both by surprise. Merritt woke with the cold threading through the seams in the logs and reached for his coat before rising. Flora sat at the hearth, coaxing the embers back to life with a length of pine kindling. Her breath showed pale in the air, and she wore her wool shawl doubled over her shoulders. You feel it coming in from the west side? She asked, without turning. He nodded, kneeling beside her to feed the fire a split log. We'll need to seal that wall before the next one hits. I'll ride into town tomorrow, pick up more pitch and lie. I'll go with you. Merritt glanced at her, surprised. You sure? She met his eyes. I want to see what it looks like from the outside. The place that used to be the whole world. He didn't argue. They left early the next morning, riding through frost-bitten grass that crunched beneath the hooves. Flora's scarf was pulled up to her cheeks, mittens stitched from thick wool covering her hands. The trail followed the river for a time, then bent south toward the low hills. Merritt rode ahead, one hand resting lightly on the horn of his saddle, his eyes flicking toward the tree line now and again. You always ride like that? She asked, drawing up beside him. Like what? Like you're expecting someone to follow. Old habits. She looked away, hands tightening on the reins. Does it ever let up? He didn't answer right away. Some days. Not all. They reached the edge of town just as the general store opened. Merritt tied the horses outside while Flora lingered near the porch, watching a wagon pass on the far end of the street. A boy in the back waved at her. She raised a gloved hand, unsure why it made her throat feel tight. Inside, the store smelled of kerosene, flour, and cured meat. Flora drifted toward a shelf of sewing needles while Merritt spoke with the clerk about the pitch. She ran her fingers over a bolt of faded calico, the print small and blue against cream. You should take it, Merritt said, appearing beside her. I didn't say anything. You looked at it like you were deciding if it was allowed. She didn't move her hand. Seems like a thing for someone who's settled. You're not passing through anymore, Flora. She picked it up and folded it under her arm. They stayed in town just long enough to gather supplies. Merritt picked up a new file for his axe, and Flora found a small wooden box of buttons carved from bone. When the wagon track turned muddy, they walked the horses to save their shoes. The sky hung low and gray, the air sharp with the promise of snow. As they neared the valley, Flora slowed her steps. There's something I need to ask. Merritt adjusted the pack on his saddle and looked at her. Go ahead. When you stopped my father that day, was it only because of what he was doing? Or did you already know what you meant to do? He paused, hands still on the saddle leather. I didn't go there planning to say what I said. But when I saw your face, saw how you stood there, proud even when he tried to sell you, I didn't want to ride away and leave you to that. She let the silence stretch between them. You didn't just pull me out, she said. You stayed. You're still staying. I will, he said, as long as I'm welcome. She looked toward the cabin, just visible now through the trees, smoke trailing from the chimney. You are. They reached the homestead by dusk. Merritt carried in the provisions while Flora laid out the calico, cutting a length for new curtains. Her hands moved with quiet purpose, each snip of the shears steady. He watched her from the door, his coat still dusted with frost. You want coffee? She asked. He nodded. I'll chop kindling first. When he returned, she handed him a tin cup, still warm from the stove. They drank in silence, the firelight softening the corners of the single-room cabin. I've been thinking, she said, not looking up from her sewing. About what? Spring. What we'll plant. Maybe potatoes and beans. Something that keeps. He smiled into his cup. You planning on staying through spring, then? She set down the needle, eyes meeting his. I'm not going anywhere, Merritt. He crossed the room, took the chair beside her. Then I'll build you a root cellar come thaw. I'd like that. Later, as the wind picked up outside and the fire settled low, Flora pulled the quilt up to her waist and turned toward him in the dark. You think we'll be all right here? His arm came around her, steady and warm. I know we will. She let her forehead rest against his chest, the sound of his heart steady beneath her ear. For the first time, she believed it. The thaw came slowly, with mud thick along the trails and the river swollen past its banks. Flora stood barefoot at the edge of their plot, toes sunk into the wet earth, sleeves rolled to her elbows. She pressed a seed potato into one of the furrows she dug with the short-handled hoe Merritt had crafted from scrap oak. Her back ached, but she felt the ache was honest, different from the bone-deep weariness she had carried for years. Merritt was fencing the south side of the field, hammering another rail into place. She heard the steady rhythm of the mallet, the occasional creak of wire. A crow passed overhead, cawing once before settling in a pine. I've been thinking about bees, Flora said, brushing dirt from her palms. Merritt looked up from his work, leaning on the fence rail. Bees. They keep to themselves. Make something sweet out of wild places. I read about it once. You want a hive? I think I'd like to learn how. He nodded. Then we'll find someone who can teach you. She straightened, stretching slowly. I never thought I'd want to learn anything again. Thought I was past that. You're not past anything, Flora. You're just getting started. Later that evening, she boiled willow bark and peppermint leaves in a tin kettle, pouring the tea into 2 cups. He bruised his hand earlier, and though he hadn't said a word about it, she'd seen the way he kept flexing his fingers. She set the cup beside him on the table. You're stubborn about pain, she said. And you're sharp about noticing things I'd rather hide. I had to be once. He reached for her hand, brushing his thumb over her knuckles. You don't have to anymore. She didn't pull away. I know. The days stretched longer, sun rising earlier each morning. They planted beans and squash beside the potatoes, and she lined the path to the cabin with smooth stones from the riverbank. Merritt built a bench from pine boards and set it beneath the tamarack tree near the door. In the evenings, they sat there with their boots off, watching the last light fade behind the ridge. One evening, after supper, Merritt laid a folded cloth on the table. Inside was a silver locket, its hinges worn but intact. I found it when we were clearing the west slope, buried in the roots of that old cedar. Thought you might want it. She picked it up carefully, opened the clasp. The space inside was empty. I don't have anything to put in it, she said. Not yet, he said. But you will. She closed it gently and fastened the chain around her neck. Maybe I'll keep a pressed flower in it. Something from what we grow here. I'd like that. By midsummer, the roof no longer leaked, the fields held strong green shoots, and the cabin smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and sun-warmed earth. The townsfolk had begun to recognize them when they rode in for salt and lamp oil. Flora traded a jar of rosehip jelly for a comb of honey and asked the beekeeper a dozen quiet questions. When they returned home, she had a small wooden hive tied behind her saddle. One morning, Merritt came in from the barn with sawdust on his sleeves and a curious look on his face. "I've been carving something," he said, and handed her a small, rounded piece of wood. She turned it in her hands. It was a cradle doll, smooth-limbed and simple, the face left blank in the old way. "I didn't know you could carve," she said. "Learned it from a man I worked cattle with in Wyoming. Said it passed the time when the snow got mean." She looked at him, her hand curled gently around the doll. "Are you trying to tell me something?" His eyes held hers. "I'd like to think about raising someone here, if you ever wanted to." She didn't look away. "I would." They didn't speak of it again that day, but that night she reached for him first, her fingers curling into his shirt as he settled beside her. And when she whispered his name against his shoulder, it wasn't with fear or uncertainty, but with the quiet strength of someone who'd chosen her place in the world. The following spring, the child was born in the same cabin they'd built with their own hands. Flora had gathered moss and warm stones weeks before, prepared the basin herself. Merritt stayed with her through every hour, holding her hand, fetching water, whispering soft words no one else would ever hear. They named the boy Elias, after Merritt's father. The child was quiet and wide-eyed, with a steady way of looking at the world that reminded Flora of both of them. She wrapped him in the quilt they'd stitched through the winter, and Merritt carried him outside to show him the land. "This is where you begin," he said, voice low, "and we'll be here every step." Years passed. The fields grew fuller. The orchard they planted began to bear. Flora kept bees and traded honey for wool, and Merritt taught Elias to fish in the shallows of the river. They built a second room on the cabin, then a barn, then a root cellar, just as he'd promised. On the morning of their 8th year together, Flora found Merritt mending the gate where the latch had warped from the weather. "Do you remember the day you claimed this land?" she asked. He looked up. "I remember the way you looked when you said it was yours, too." She leaned against the post, arms crossed. "Wasn't sure then. But I am now." He stepped toward her, lifted the edge of her braid. "Tell me, we made something out of nothing," she said. "And I love you for every nail, every seed, every word you never had to say." He pulled her close, kissed her temple. "It's all yours, Flora. Always was." She rested her forehead against his. "And you are." They stood there a long while, wind moving through the grasses, the bees humming low by the hives. Inside the house, Elias read by the hearth, his boots muddy from the creek, his face freckled from sun. And in every corner of that life in the turned soil, the worn tools, the quiet glances, they had built something unshakable. Not by grand declaration, but by the steady fire of choosing each other every single day.